Well, thanks for joining us at Agri-Pulse.com for our latest Meet the Farmhands video. Pleased to be joined today by John Gordley, the founder and chief of Gourley Associates here in Washington, D.C. John, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
For starters, can you give us a little bit of an idea about the timeline of your career, going as far back as you'd like to, just kind of the places that you've been throughout your professional history?
Well, a little atypical since I'm relatively out of agriculture. When I was growing up in New York and near Chicago, I happened to meet my wife at a rural college in Iowa, and she was from Kansas. So, you know, her mother learned about my background and was kind of chary about whether or not I was ever going to move back there. And what she didn't know is that my wife really wasn't planning to move back there, and that's why she picked me out. So that led to my mother-in-law, finding a job with what was now U.S. Wheat Associates. It was Great Plains Wheat. I'd spoke some French. I'd lived in Egypt with Susie, and so we were selected to open an office to promote wheat exports to Africa. So that was in Casablanca, Morocco. After a few years there, I came back here and changed jobs. And the next one I had, I can attribute to my wife's background, since it was with Senator Bob Dole. And during the interview, he poked his head in the room and he said, "Where's your wife from?" I said, "Nickerson, Kansas." So when I would go out with him to all the town meetings, he would introduce me as not from where I'm from, but where my wife's from. So I worked for Senator Dole about 5 years, and it was a little cameo appearance at the White House Office of Policy Development during the Reagan administration. But Senator Dole wanted me back to work on the '85 Farm Bill, so back I went. And you know, when I finished up there, I worked a little bit at Hill and Knowlton. It was a little bit too much PR for me, and I wanted to get back to lobbying. So I set up my business in 1987 and have been doing it ever since. I started with an answering machine, then half a person, then a full-time person, and now there are 8 people here in the office. So that's against all odds, still in business.
Very good. Now, I want to go back to kind of the beginning of that, the explanation that you gave me. You ended up at Grinnell College in Iowa. It's a very small college in Iowa, and you grew up in suburban Chicago, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So how does a guy in suburban Chicago end up going to school at a very small Iowa college? I mean, I found an enrollment figure from 2011 of 1,600, so very, very small place.
It's grown.
Yeah.
About 1,200 kids when I was there. Well, I was trying to get as far away from cities and suburbs as I could and still be one-day travel, just as my wife was trying to get from rural Kansas to a one-day trip for her dad to drive her to school. So we just coincidentally ended up at the same place. My mother and one of her brothers actually did spend time going to school at Grinnell, so there was a little bit in the family background.
Okay. And your father was in the oil industry?
Yeah, you're well informed.
Yeah,
he worked for Standard Oil of Indiana, which at that point was Amoco. So when we were born, my brother and I, he was working in New York City, and they moved him back to the mothership in Chicago before he retired. So that's how we got that kind of big city background.
So I'm sitting across from the son of an oil man who at one point was handling ag issues for the Senate Majority Leader. How does that happen?
That is correct. Actually, my father grew up on a quarter section farm in southern Illinois, so that's how far back you have to find agriculture in my background. But I was originally a history teacher, and then I found that was the hardest thing I ever tried to do when we lived in Egypt, was to try to teach high school kids. So I went back and went to Thunderbird Graduate School of International Management in Glendale, Arizona, and got a master's in international marketing. And that's when I picked the wheat job, or when my mother-in-law plugged me into the wheat job. It seemed like a good industry to get in the late 70s. Agriculture was booming, so I said that's where I'll go.
And in your time with Senator Dole, I mean, he was the Senate Majority Leader. That's one of the most powerful men in Washington, lawmakers, lobbyists, or otherwise. What did you learn during that time working for him?
Well, Senator Dole was a great boss to work for. He was originally finance chairman when I went to work for him, and then he became Majority Leader, and that's when I went back to work for him after my little stint at the White House. But I learned if you did your job well, you'd get responsibility. He basically turned the ag responsibility over to me, told all the lobbyists, you go see Gordley and don't bother me all the time. And and it worked out quite well. And you learn how to handle responsibility, and that's what all young people that go to work on Capitol Hill, that's the experience they get. And it's a great way to learn whatever field you're working in, and how to handle relationships with people, because relationships in this town is really what's most important.
And shifting gears a little bit here, let's talk a little bit about Gourley Associates. You say you've got a staff of 8 now. Can you just give us a 30-second elevator speech or so about who you guys are, your staff size, your clientele, areas of influence?
Yes, and again, coming out of my experience with Senator Dole and foreign market development work, I could have just as easily have gone to work for a large company, agribusiness, for example, like a lot of folks do. It happened that one of the first clients I got when I was still at Hill and Knowlton was the National Sunflower Association. And that's a farmer-led trade association. And a few years later, the U.S. Canola Association was created. And we actually are the headquarters for USCA here in our office, another farmer-led trade association. And then a few years after that, the American Soybean Association decided to close their Washington office. They had a full-time shop here, and they had a beauty contest. 7 different companies come in, and at that point it was just me. So I put a chair next to myself, and I knew that there's a diverse search committee that included some Southerners, including a fellow from Mississippi who had other ideas about who they should hire. So I simply said, well, if I get this account, I'm going to have to hire somebody to work on domestic issues for ASA, and I'm going to make sure that everybody on the search committee is happy with the person I choose. And the person I got the account, and then the person I hired was Krista Harden.
Okay.
And so Krista was here for 11 years before she went on to other things and higher things like NACD, and then obviously the Department of Agriculture, where she did so well.
Okay. And primarily food and agriculture clients then, or exclusively maybe?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
We have a couple companies we've worked for, but we've got National Barley Growers Association. We've got the USA Dry Pea and Lentil Council. We got the US Dry Bean Council. So we got kind of the pulse groups. We got some oilseed groups. Mm-hmm. And people say, well, isn't that a conflict of interest of some kind? And not really, because most of those groups have most things in common in terms of policy. I mean, what farmers choose to plant and what consumers choose to buy are things that we really don't have much impact over here. But everything else that, different oil seeds or different pulse crops, they tend to have confluent interests, and it helps when you have just one shop doing that work in this town.
Now, personally, being the son of a farmer and growing up around many others, I know that farmers are kind of the type that like to do things for themselves. And they really like to be the ones that, if you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. Yeah. And that seems to be an attitude that is kind of carried over to a lot of their policy making. A lot of the big ag companies or a lot of the big ag organizations have their own lobbying and policy shops. But you've managed to hold on to quite a few ag clients throughout your almost 30 years of running the Gourley Associates. Kind of bluntly, how have you done it?
Well, you basically gain the confidence of the people you work for, that you're going to get as much in their interest as you can get done in this town, but you're going to have to work with members of Congress who they may be constituents of, but we have to be able to ask them to do reasonable things, and we can't ask the impossible of. And so you got to have the confidence of your clients that you're going to get as much as you can for them, but you're not going to estrange yourself or them from the members of Congress who need to do these things for them. Mm-hmm. So it's a relationship, it's a confidence building function, and relationships really are key to being effective in Washington.
Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about the key policy for agriculture, the farm bills that have been going on through quite some time. You've seen a number of them either on Capitol Hill or as a lobbyist.
7.
7 of them, okay. Throughout the course of those 7 farm bills, not necessarily the nitty-gritty policy details, but the behind-the-scenes action of getting the bill written and produced and getting it to a point where it can be sent to the White House. How have you seen that process change?
Not as much as people would think.
Really?
People look at the politics that we have today and all the gridlock and how difficult it is to get something done, and admittedly it's gotten harder to get farm bills done. They take 2 or 3 years now instead of 1 or 2 years, instead of at the beginning back in 81, 85, it just took the same year that we got those bills done. So it's harder, but in terms of what's in the Farm Bill, there's something in there for just about everybody. Every senator has got farm interests, and the trade-offs, if I get this in the bill, then I'll vote for whatever you want to get in the bill. That kind of old-fashioned, not exactly horse trading, but what's in it for me, what's in it for my people back home, is still very much alive and well in farm legislation, and that includes, the 70% of the cost of the bill that goes to nutrition programs, primarily food stamps or SNAP. And that relationship between nutrition programs and agriculture programs dates back to 1964 when food stamps was made a nationwide program instead of a pilot program. And those have been tied together ever since. Why would, there's only 38 members of the House of Representatives from districts with more than 50% rural population. So what are you going to do for all the other members of the House who are basically looking at the perspective of representing urban constituents, a lot of whom are dependent on the food stamp program? So for that reason, we feel very strongly that we need to keep the linkage between agriculture and nutrition if we're going to keep having a farm bill.
All right, let's wrap things up here talking about not necessarily your work on Capitol Hill, but your work personally. I understand that when you're not lobbying for food and agriculture interests, you do appreciate the finer side of food consumption.
I don't know what that means. No, we have a good time. Our office will have lunch together at least once a week, and my wife and I enjoy good restaurants. We also like to travel, and it's not all vacations either. It depends on where you go. But we took a trip and we got to Vietnam, and we went down the river there, the Mekong, and you saw how people live. You saw how they are hand to mouth basically with rice and what fish they catch, and probably no money in their pocket. And you start to understand, and we've done the same thing with Brazil, going down, visiting, seeing those large farms in the Mato Grosso region. And you get to understand a little bit more about the world's agriculture. And I think that people who work in agriculture policy and not just trade policy really need to travel and really need to see how the rest of the world is trying to feed itself, because we have a big challenge, as you know, coming up in the next 34 years or so before 9.7 billion people in the year 2050, and we need to work on international ag development. That's something that is sort of near and dear to my heart, and we have a coalition that works on that too.
And I also understand you have a hidden musical talent?
No.
Really?
If you're referring to my having played the banjo, this was in high school and college, and after that I picked it up a couple times over in Egypt because I ran into a oil rigger guy who had his huge guitar, and so we'd play some music together. But ever since I came back from there, it's just been pretty much work and no more music.
Do you think, is it like riding a bike? If I were to hand you one right now, could you be able to pluck out a song or anything?
No. The coordination in one's fingers, if you don't keep it moving, then they forget where they're going. What used to be, I knew exactly which strings I could hit for like 5 years after I gave it up, but now couldn't do it.
Okay. And what about family? You've mentioned your wife a little bit. Any other family that you have?
I've got 2 sons. One is in San Francisco, and he's got the brains in the family, from my brother's side, I guess. But he is a scientist. He's in a postdoc program at the University of California, San Francisco. He got his doctorate at Scripps Research Institute. He went to Swarthmore, all the credentials, but he's still trying to find his first job outside the lab, if you will, in academia. And the younger son is quite a charming fellow, and got over to Sweden, ran into a Norwegian girl, and they now live in Oslo, and he's a resident there. He's learned the language. They encourage you to learn Norwegian and assimilate to the extent you can. And he gets into all kinds of volunteer work. He's kind of in the ecology department, very green, as they both are, and they're expecting their first child in November.
Oh, so. First grandchild?
We had 2, I should have mentioned the son in San Francisco has 2, a boy and a girl. Okay. And we don't know what the next one's going to be in Oslo. We're going to be surprised.
Fair enough. Well, I'll wrap up with this one. If you in your present day could tell any one thing to the version of John Gordley that walked into Senator Bob Dole's office on his first day on the job, what would that be?
That you're going to have a wild ride working in agriculture, and it's going to go from being something of a afterthought, or people that don't even think about where their food's coming from, to 30 years later, 35 years later, people want to know where it's coming from, how it's made. But what they're not appreciating is the importance of science and the role science has played during that period of time and even before, and needs to play going forward in making, keeping up with the world's population growth. We've really got to do a better job with these new plant breeding techniques like gene editing than we did with biotech in terms of gaining consumer acceptance, and not just in here, but around the world.
John, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure.